Welcome to Asset TV's Boutique Connect update with Currency Partners. I'm Joanne Baynham. Today I'm joined by Kirsten Kratz, Regional Sales Manager, the Western Cape. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
Okay, we're going to go do some basics today and then get into some more interesting topics. Let's start off with a really simple question. How much money can a South African tax resident take offshore each year?
So you've got your single discretionary allowance, which is 1 million rand that you can externalize. What a lot of people aren't aware of is what that actually applies to. So what we occasionally come across is South African tax residents who've exceeded their single discretionary allowance because a Netflix subscription has gone off or they've subscribed to a podcast that's being billed overseas. So the single discretionary allowance is everything. It's anything and everything you swipe overseas in terms of travel, any flights that are booked and paid for in foreign currency. So that's the single discretionary allowance. And then you've got your foreign investment allowance, which is an additional 10 million rand that as a South African resident you can externalize. With that, you do require a tax clearance from SARS. And then anything that is in excess of your single discretionary and your foreign investment, so in excess of the 11 million, would require a special approval application to the Reserve Bank. So there is actually no limit in terms of how much you can externalize through a special application to the Reserve Bank. But what is important is that you first need to obtain the tax clearance, and then thereafter can you apply to the Reserve Bank for an approval.
Okay, and just help me, can a 5-year-old take money offshore, or do you have to be 18 and older? Are there any rules around that?
There are rules around that. So unfortunately, a minor does not have an annual allowance. There is an exception in that a minor can externalize funds, but only through travel. So there's a 200,000 rand allowance, but it's for travel specifically. So we often get asked the question, can I invest overseas on behalf of my child? Unfortunately not. That 200,000 rand allowance is for travel alone. And if a parent wanted to externalize for a minor, unfortunately, they would have to use their own annual allowances to do so.
And the definition of minor is 18 or 21?
18.
18,
Yes.
Okay. And do these allowances apply to non-residents as well, or is it just South Africans?
Just South African tax residents, so South African individuals. And then what is also important to note is that it doesn't apply to entities either. So, for example, a company doesn't have an allowance, a trust doesn't have an allowance. It's specifically for South African tax individuals.
Wow, so companies and trusts don't?
No.
So if a trust wants to take money offshore, what company does? How does that work?
So if a trust wants to take money offshore, it first has to distribute to a beneficiary. So that could be a South African tax resident, it could be a South African immigrant who's actually ceased their tax residency and moved overseas, or it could be a non-resident. But it has to do a capital distribution to an individual beneficiary who in turn would externalize the funds. And companies, it would be foreign direct investment. So there is an allowance in that sense that a company can externalize funds. But through foreign direct investment, what is important to note is that a company needs to, if a South African entity wants to externalize funds on behalf of a company through foreign direct investments, they need to have an active part or role that they're playing in the company that they're investing in. So it can't be deemed as a passive investment, like property, for example.
Or Bitcoin offshore, something like that. So that it has to be active, it can't be passive.
It has to be active. So there needs to be some shareholding ownership or a day-to-day contribution to operational activities, whatever that might be, but it has to be deemed active.
Okay. Are there exemptions that exist?
Yes,
Tell me
there
about
are,
them.
to the annual allowances.
To the annual allowances, yes. Sorry, back to that one, the
There
beneficiary
are a
one.
few exemptions. So I've touched on one now, which is relating to minors in the sense of that travel allowance that a parent can use to externalize funds on behalf of their child. Another one that's interesting, and this has popped up quite a lot, is children who are now studying overseas. So parents are funding tuition in the UK, in the USA, wherever it might be. And what parents are not aware of is that tuition fees don't actually form part of their annual allowances. So what we have seen is parents externalizing funds against their annual allowances to pay for tuition, when in actual fact, if the parent was to pay the institution directly, that does not form part of their annual allowances. So
Let's go
tuition
back a
fees
step.
is
Okay, so the child can't take money offshore because that doesn't fall under the allowance.
if they are
under 18, okay.
Yes.
And then it has to go into the parents' allowance, but if the parents pay directly to the institutions,
It doesn't form part of the allowance. It's an exemption.
why not? Oh, that's the exemption.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, all right, that's careful planning there.
Absolutely, and I think now it's actually very common where
But what about their
Africans
accommodation or their food bills? Now that would go back into the allowance.
So again, I mean, if it's accommodation through the university and it technically forms part of the tuition package, again, I mean, the parent, if they're paying for that accommodation to the institution directly, it can be exempt from their individual allowances. So it's popping up a lot. A lot of South Africans are sending their children overseas to study, and just something worth noting. And then in terms of another exemption, what comes to mind is a medical special dispensation. So, I mean, that's very few and far between, but if you're traveling and you happen to fall ill or have surgery overseas, with proof of that medical dispensation, you actually can use that as an exemption to annual allowances, so that you aren't, externalizing funds through your allowances to pay for medical bills overseas.
It's still amazingly draconian. It's just ridiculous. Okay, so now the lucky client's got money offshore and decides they want to do something with this money because they had bored of it sitting in a bank account. Do they have to bring the money back to South Africa, or can they invest the money offshore?
So they can keep the money overseas, as long as it's been used, if it's been externalized through their annual allowances, and now, for example, they've got it either sitting in a bank account or they've got it invested with a specific asset manager, and they decide they want to disinvest and reinvest with another asset manager overseas, they don't actually have to bring those funds back because it's already been externalized against their annual allowances. So a vehicle, in order to be able to facilitate that, because what we often come across is this is a South African individual who's not actually able to open up a transactional bank account overseas because they're not living there. Mm-hmm. So what can be used is a foreign currency account in order to disinvest from one investment portfolio, hold the funds, and then reinvest it from there. So a foreign currency account, it is a South African domiciled product, but it's an account held in the individual's name in multiple different currencies. We can open them in over 12 currencies, used specifically for that reason, to disinvest and reinvest without needing to bring the funds back to South Africa.
And they could also keep it there for a while as well. They wouldn't have to. They wouldn't have to necessarily have to invest. It's not just a in and out.
100%.
They can hold it there for a long.
They can hold it. I mean, buy and hold. And also what we have seen is sometimes the offshore, if it's an offshore endowment, for example, can take quite some time to actually open up that investment portfolio.
Absolutely.
So if a client wants to take advantage of preferential rates now, they can open up or use a foreign currency account to buy and hold foreign currency, and it can be held indefinitely.
Okay, and Currency Partners obviously facilitates this.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. And then what exchange controls regulations apply to South Africans who inherit offshore? Can they just keep it offshore? Do they have to bring it back? How does that work?
Yeah, so I suppose it's twofold. It depends whether the individual is inheriting from a pure non-resident estate. So, for example, a grandmother who had absolutely no ties to South Africa. If a South African individual is inheriting from a pure non-resident estate, they can actually keep the funds overseas. So I think it was 17th of March 1998. If it was inherited after that date, you can actually hold or retain the funds offshore without needing to declare it to an authorized dealer or place it on record with the South African Reserve Bank. So you can.
So you don't even have to tell the
assets.
SARB you have the money there.
No, you can retain it because it comes from a pure non-resident source. If you inherited funds prior to that and did not declare, but prior to that 1998 date, then you would have to regularize it and place it on record with the Reserve Bank. So, we don't come across that very often, given that the change was made in 1998.
Yes.
But on the flip side, if you are a South African resident, and this we see a lot, inheriting from a South African estate, but you're inheriting offshore assets. We see it a lot because, as South Africans, we're living globally, purchasing properties overseas, etc. So our local estates now have offshore assets. So a South African inheriting offshore assets, but from a local estate, again, they can retain those assets offshore. The caveat there is that if you inherited them after 23rd of February 2022, you can retain them offshore. You do need to disclose it, though, from a tax perspective, but you don't need to bring the funds back. If you inherited it before that date, you would also need to place it on record and regularize it with the Reserve Bank.
All right, so anyone dealing with currencies knows the rand is incredibly volatile. I think we call it the rattlesnake or something like that. You said you've got some policies and procedures in place to help with that, mitigate the volatility.
Yes.
Tell me more.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to basics here. So oftentimes, we don't know what the rand is going to do, and we don't err on the side of speculation. So the conversations that we have with the likes of financial advisors and their clients is really around how to mitigate that risk. And just one tool, for lack of a better word, is a rate alert. So if you have a specific exchange rate that you want to externalize funds at, let's say 17 Rand to the US dollar, what a rate alert is simply a note for a dealer to give you a call and inform you that we've hit the rate, would you like to move now? So, that's in its simplest form. A rate alert at least helps a client or a financial advisor, without having to constantly monitor rates, at least stay on top of where the rate is at. And then a market order. So a market order is another sort of tool where if you have the funds ready to go and there's a particular rate that you want to execute at, a market order will automatically trigger regardless of the time. So you can place a market order and let's say you want to externalize your 1 million Rand at 17 Rand to the US dollar. If the account is funded, market order will automatically trigger and you've achieved your desired rate. So that's one way to mitigate it. And then the third one would be a hedging instrument. So for example, a forward exchange contract where you are actually buying currency for a future date, usually up to around 6 months in advance.
Okay, so there are plans and procedures. We can do something.
Yes.
Okay, Kirsten, thank you. I actually learned something today about foreign exchange. I didn't realise that you could pay for varsity fees directly. So I think that's something very interesting for a lot of people watching this. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.